All right. Good afternoon. Welcome to Surveillance in Academic Libraries, a Search for Better Ideas. This town hall is sponsored by the Privacy Subcommittee of the American Library Association's Intellectual Freedom Committee in collaboration with Digital Library Federation's Privacy and Ethics and Technology Working Group and Library Freedom Project. So first, housekeeping. During this webinar, I will be facilitating the discussion and asking your questions. At any time, submit your questions via the Zoom Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. This will help us make sure that we're not missing questions. The right-hand chat can be used to share links, introductions, and experiences. Before the webinar, we ask that you note these community agreements created by the ALA Office for Diversity, Literacy, and Outreach Services and outlined on the slide. Be present, bring all of yourself to the discussion, set aside distractions. Everyone is invited to speak. Practice self-awareness. Only share what you can carry. Everyone is responsible for this space. Trust people's lived experiences. This webinar is being recorded, and we will share the recording link with all the registrants. It will also be uploaded to the Office of Intellectual Freedom's YouTube channel. Discussion of the possibility of surveillance in university libraries has caused concern and sparked conversations among library workers and other privacy and intellectual freedom advocates. A recent keynote given at the Virtual Security Summit of the Scholarly Network Security Initiative claimed that from an information security perspective, libraries are a quote-unquote weak link. The talk proposed surveillance of library users and suggested that libraries might broker patron data to secure lower prices on subscription resources. The talk's stated purpose was to stimulate thought and produce better ideas. In today's town hall, we will explore the mutual and crucial understanding and collaboration between libraries and information security personnel. Now I'll introduce today's special guests. Roy Hatcher is an information security professional with over 20 years experience in information technology and higher education. As an administrator of federated authentication systems, he is familiar with the intersection of identity and privacy requirements in our always connected world. He currently serves on the Entity Category and Attribute Bundles Working Group and is a senior security engineer at JB Hunt Transportation Incorporated. His current projects include open federation systems and educating youth in information security. I am Michelle Gibeault. I am chair of instruction and librarian for humanities at Tulane University. I also serve as co-convener of the Digital Library Federation's Privacy and Ethics and Technology Working Group, and I'm a member of the ALA Privacy Subcommittee of the Intellectual Freedom Committee. I'm coming to you from New Orleans, Louisiana. So I think the first thing I'd like to do is to ask Roy to give a little overview of, sort of summary of his thoughts of the SSNI or Sensi, I believe, conference that kind of sparked this this discussion today. So, hey, Roy.
Hello. Thanks for having me, everybody, and thanks for coming and attending. This is fantastic. I look forward to the opportunity to answer some questions and spark some improved collaboration between library folk and IT and cybersecurity folk. First, the usual disclaimer, today these opinions are my own. They don't reflect the opinions of any of my current or former employers. So going from there, I had the opportunity to actually view that webinar, and a few thoughts that I came away with, some positive things and some negative things, of course. I think one of the things to recognize is a lot of the, I would say, more caution or ideas that came of concern. These were being talked about from a security perspective, and not necessarily from a privacy perspective, and not necessarily from a library perspective, but from the perspective of a security department given a problem to solve. What can compromised credentials do, and how can we solve that? That's really the angle that was coming from, was what are the solutions that can do that? And some of the things I thought that were brought up that were very good was the obstacles that libraries and institutes of higher ed have to face. One of the big ones is, of course, privacy. Also with libraries, you've got, or institutes of higher education, you've got expertise, especially in the cybersecurity field. You can hardly go a day without seeing how much there's a shortage of cybersecurity professionals, which just caused there to be a high demand in the private sector, and it's very hard for higher learning to compete with the private sector as far as wages are concerned, as far as benefits from that front. And leading into that is also just the sheer cost, both of the personnel and of the more advanced cybersecurity tools to do some of the suggestions made in that talk, such as, hopefully we'll dive into some user behavior analytics here in a bit, but that's definitely, those tools aren't cheap. They even mention about the open source versions of those tools, which are cheap from a software perspective, but not cheap from a management and maintenance perspective, and not nearly as advanced and robust in their capabilities. Probably the most important thing, I think, in even that talk hit on this quite a bit, is the importance of collaboration. Later in the talk, you hear from a man named Tim Lloyd, who talks a lot about how federated access has the ability to do quite a bit of things. It can be as privacy preserving or as privacy invasive as a person or entity wants it to be. And so the importance is the technical expertise and the privacy education to implement the tools in the proper way. And that, I think, is where fostering collaboration between library staff, library technical staff, and the campus's information technology staff really comes to play a big portion of that, because configuring those tools properly is both a skill set and technical expertise, but is also sort of a mindset and an understanding how privacy comes into play and how those tools can be configured. Overall, I enjoyed that talk, but there's definitely some concerning issues I thought that were brought up, mainly dealing with addressing the concerns of how to stop illegal use of compromised credentials and things like that, addressing those concerns from a security first perspective rather than, say, a privacy first perspective.
And so I actually have a question. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
So I have a question about that, and I just wanted to hear what you had to say. So one of the things I've been thinking about for the last couple of weeks is this idea that you could be completely secure. The entire information security department could be completely happy, and you could have a completely not private situation in terms of sharing, user data with, vendors, and, in particular is a big concern.
Mm-hmm.
So it becomes then an important, and I think somebody put it really, really well. Peter Murray, I was reading his article, and I think he's here. Just this idea, I think this idea that libraries and librarians need to be able to gracefully communicate the importance of privacy. And so I was just wondering what your thoughts are on that. It's possible to have a completely secure environment, but have no privacy.
Well, I would say first, there is no such thing as a completely secure environment. It's definitely something vendors try to sell in their tools, but 100% security doesn't exist. And I would argue that any cybersecurity professional would agree. And what we do is we leverage risk. Different tools can reduce the risk of, say, information exposure, but 100% secure is a hypothetical mathematical number and not achievable in the real world. However, you do have a very good point about the fact that security and privacy are not the same thing, unfortunately. Or I don't know if unfortunate is the right word. They're two very different things, but a lot of times they get related. One of the pillars of cybersecurity is the concept of confidentiality. And I would really pair that over to sort of what privacy is as well. In a infrastructure, confidentiality is, protecting the information so that only the people who should be able to see that information are able to see it. From that tenet, I would argue that privacy is a pretty big concern even for security. Privacy can only exist in the confines of security. If you don't have a way to protect the data, then it's definitely not private. However, when it comes to sort of the priorities of an information security department, privacy might not always be the main thing that they're thinking about, especially when you're talking with relations between vendors and the library, or vendors and the university institutions. A lot of times they come in and they say, oh, you've bought this service from us, and now we need you to share these pieces of things with us so that we can provide the service that you've bought for us. And a lot of times in IT departments, they're focused on the how. They're focused on the, okay, we now need to figure out how to make this happen. How do we get the information that they need? And I think that's where, privacy experts can come in and help from the perspective of, okay, well, we know what they want, but is that something we necessarily want to give? And that's a perspective that's not always present within the IT departments, as is how the vendor's telling us what they need or what they want, but what are we contractually obligated to give them? What do they actually need to provide the service that we're asking them to provide?
So, and following up on what you said, this idea of confidentiality, is that just taken as a given, or is there any philosophical underpinning of it? Because the idea within libraries is that privacy, without privacy, you don't have intellectual freedom, which is, sort of one of the purposes of access to information in a democracy. So is that ever plumbed anymore, like this idea of like, why confidentiality?
Well, it's plumbed from several sort of basic cybersecurity tenets of confidentiality, such as the idea of least privilege. So what you have then is people should only have access to what they should have access to and nothing more. And so confidentiality becomes an effect of that principle. So if nobody can have access to anything more than what they should have access to, then confidentiality will naturally be retained. It is a basic core principle. However, how it gets implemented or maintained is normally done more from the perspective of what tools do you use and how are those tools configured. A lot of times confidentiality comes in from the perspective of, say, read and write permissions on share folders, or even creating accounts in the first place on a system. So it really goes back to sort of the permissions of who has access to the data.
Thank you. So we have a new question from one of my favorite people, but because I don't have permission to necessarily name those who are asking the question, I'll keep it anonymous. She says, "Hi, Roy, and thank you for being here. I teach introductory InfoSec in an information school, and I explain the InfoSec term visibility to students as knowing what's going on a device, ideally as it's happening," end quote. Could you speak to the tension between InfoSec visibility and the privacy of information use, in which what's going on is ideally nobody else's business?
Okay. That's an excellent way to phrase visibility, as knowing what's happening or going on, both on a device or perhaps as to what a user is doing. Unfortunately, I would say that the tension between InfoSec visibility and privacy is vast, or strung quite tightly. And the reason for that is there's definitely perspective that the more you know about what's going on, the more you can address or make sure that what's going on is safe and secure. So from an information security perspective, there is the idea that the more you can see going on, the safer you can make sure things are happening. The more data you have, the more you can analyze it. Some of this stuff now is the data is so vast that it's not a person looking at it anymore. These things are being done on machines algorithmically looking at the information and making judgment calls on that. And this is why the privacy perspective is so important to bring into bear, because there's definitely the tension of making sure you are seeing enough to make security decisions, but trying to avoid seeing so much that you're violating privacy. Yeah, I guess that's probably, without diving down into, say, user behavior analytics or SIM technology and how those work, there's definitely in the information world, just more data is better as far as identifying possible security incidents. But violation of privacy on that is certainly present. Um, in the higher ed world, where you're looking, where you should be less concerned with or trying to avoid any of the say, knowing what sites an academic researcher is going to. Unfortunately, the tools themselves are not designed for that marketplace, and configuring them in such a way to be privacy preserving could be difficult, if not, man, almost impossible on some of them, because they're looking at things at the network traffic level, at the packet level, and at that level, it would be very hard to discern even when you're violating privacy until you've almost already violated it. I hope that answers the question. And also, kudos to you to educate people introductory InfoSec. That's definitely a difficult task, and we need more people doing it.
That actually comes to a question that I've had, because I could be wrong about this, but you never had a classroom experience where you're learning about InfoSec, right? You've learned it all on the job, or like, as you know, training that goes along with your job.
Yeah, I personally, my only classroom InfoSec experience has been more recently being the teacher for some engineering summer camps where juniors and seniors in high school came for a week or two of intensive cybersecurity training. And that's been the only actual classroom experience I've had. Before that, it was just the information superhighway and the vast amount of knowledge that can be gained if you just have access to information and are willing to spend the time and have the dedication to learn it. It's kind of interesting because that brings
I
up
have
the
a
point.
corollary. I have a
Oh,
corollary.
I was
So
just gonna say. Oh yeah, go ahead.
you feel as though that you're going to be more of a minority as information security becomes more of a field where it'll be required that people, sort of earn, sort of certificates and degrees, et cetera, in this? And if so, do we see a possible path of, sort of collaboration between iSchools, like Dorothea teaches that, and, places that are teaching information security? Because ideally, to me, what it would mean would be, where information security professionals are being trained, doing a reading about why librarians care about information, or I'm sorry, about privacy. I remember, when I first met you, I always thought it was very curious because you always felt like librarians were the original IT people. And most IT people don't feel that way. So I guess my question is that where can we structure the kinds of collaboration that we're trying to build ad hoc in the workplace right now? Is that possible? And how do you think that could work?
Yeah, I definitely think librarians are the original IT people. If you look at sort of how data structures work and that kind of thing, a lot of that has its origins in libraries before computers were a thing. Yes, I do feel that ad hoc learning and self learning, while sort of is a driving force behind, say, the hacker mindset, we are going to see more and more cybersecurity professionals actually coming from an education background. Currently, we have a fair bit of that. There's a substantial portion of professionals that come out, say, the signals intelligence training that the military has given them. And so a lot of ex-military enter cybersecurity that way. But seeing education sort of creep into higher ed and now into high schools and certain types of technical charter schools, there's definitely the opportunity for more formalized education. And much like how you're seeing ethics classes being brought into business schools, it would be nice to see sort of privacy and ethics being brought into the formalized cybersecurity training as well. So it becomes much more than just how do we protect data, how do we protect users, but also how we protect them from all the other methods that are trying to get a hold of their data. How do we protect their privacy even with our own, within our own systems that are trying to protect them securely?
Right. And so this brings me to a question that we had from before, the town hall. And it touches on a lot of things that aren't really a focus right now. But, you know, I think that both you and I can address it just sort of from the perspective of intellectual freedom. The question is, if the budget and or cost is the driving force or forces, how would we design the business proposal by life and safety focus or risk management focus? As a security director, I may utilize cameras to ensure we have everyone out of space for drills or real events, fire or active shooter. Staff may be skeptical with cameras in the workspaces with monitoring work tasking. How do I reassure that cameras are not utilized for those purposes?
Interesting. So that physical surveillance is quite the topic for sure, and seeing how cameras have been utilized in institutions of higher ed, there's some legitimate concerns for privacy from users. And I think if I was just thinking off the top of my head, as far as if you're going with cameras that are, say, for this instance, being used just for drills to verify that a building is not occupied, I would probably say that just like security, most users, the more information you can give them at the right time, probably the better. If you remember older cameras, and new cameras can have this as well, they actually had a little red light that was on when the camera was on. And now whether some users trust that light or not is a different story altogether. But I do think that, you know, something like that might help. Something that allows a person to visually know whether a camera is on or not. Also to pre-announce when you know they're going to be things. To the level that you can. I'm not sure with certain types of drills if you're allowed to warn people ahead of time or not. But I think definitely if the purpose of the cameras is to be on in such a way that it's not all the time, then some form of visual indication plus some pre-notification about it would alleviate a lot of the rational and reasonable concerns. There's of course going to be some, oh yeah.
The concern that any camera is going to alter behavior, though, is something that is I think what Aaron would point out and other people, you know, on this committee, is that once you're bringing cameras into libraries, people see them and it changes their behavior.
Yeah.
And that's, you know, sort of a baseline that very often I think goes unspoken.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, then the question might be, is a camera the way to solve that, to answer that question? Is a camera the only methodology for determining if there's people in the building or not? I know at the University of Arkansas, where I worked before, several buildings, including the library, for purposes of usage statistics, had essentially counters for people coming in and entering and exiting the buildings. And these were literally just at the entrances of the buildings and only just they had no way to identify who was who, just somebody entered the building and somebody left the building. So theoretically, some math on that could also tell you if the building is empty or not, assuming it's 100% accurate. But that might be the other route to go through is there a way to get this information that does not require something that has so much potential to alter the research of users, alter the behavior of users?
So we have a question from chat. Shouldn't there be policy in place governing the purpose of security cameras, and preferably one that has input by all parties involved?
I would welcome that. Definitely. The hard part there becomes, you know, who has permissions to do that kind of thing. Like, I guess that comes back to collaboration and staying informed with the various departments. Unfortunately, I don't know about other universities, but the ones I've been at have had very diverse user groups from the perspective of, especially from the idea of who would put in, say, security cameras. You've got parking and transit putting in security cameras at times. You've got the police department putting in security cameras. You've got certain departments that have seen some of the learning analytics effects that cameras can do. So it would be lovely to see sort of all the stakeholders get together and come up with a unified policy for when and where security cameras can go and how they're to be used, and publish that policy. That would be ideal. I would appreciate that, but it's hard to know how to implement that.
So I actually would like to sort of focus. We don't have any more questions currently. I hope that people will submit them. I don't want to let you off the hook without some, sort of discussion of what I know is top of mind in terms of concerns among a lot of my colleagues, which is the way that, sort of within federations, the way that trusted parties are, sort of welcomed into federations, and whether or not vendors wind up, becoming trusted parties. And if so, are there default attributes that are released about patrons? And how can people who don't have technical expertise come to understand this? And how can we, because I really want to get at the nitty gritty of what your working group is doing, and sort of how librarians can follow along and sort of comprehend some of the details of that. So maybe we can just kind of get your thoughts.
Sure, yeah. So when I was working for University of Arkansas, we were, I was one of the administrators for the Gibeault system, which is an open source federated access single sign-on solution, and it was also integrated with the InCommon Federation. And so what you have with, say, the InCommon Federation is essentially sort of a framework and policy in which any member institution has agreed to certain things. Some of those, a lot of those things are more from a technological standpoint. Like they all agree to support SAML 2.0. And I guess for people here, SAML is a secure authentication messaging protocol, or messaging language. Oh, I'm sorry, markup language. It's basically a way in which you can send authentication and authorization information about a user. So to put it in, I guess, layman's terms, if a person wanted to log into this website and this website uses single sign-on, then when the user tries to log in, that website's going to redirect them, in our case, to Shibboleth, and then the user would enter their credentials into that system. So the website, the vendor, would never see those credentials. And then when they got done logging in, then the SAML packet, which is all the stuff like basically saying, yes, they had the correct username and password to log in, so they are this person, and any attributes they wanted to send would then get sent to that vendor. Within Federation, you're agreeing to some of those terms. You're agreeing to what certain attributes would contain, the format that those attributes are in, how the markup language would work for that. And so it's a lot of technical agreements from that perspective. Now, from the perspective of what you by default release, there is no, from what I can find, there is no actual default release. Even when multiple groups are part of a federation itself, there's a certain amount of trust from the perspective of how their stuff is going to talk to each other, but they still haven't necessarily agreed to send specific attributes to another member of that federation. There's still a conversation between those two parties that needs to happen.
So I think this is actually a good question, and maybe they've covered it on the working group, or maybe just in talking with other people. So how often do implementers at identity providers like campus ID departments just throw up their hands and send all available metadata about people by default? Or is it commoner to consider which metadata to send depending on each use case?
Yes, this is an excellent question. So if we talk about, there's a couple of sides of metadata from a federation perspective. So one part of the metadata that exists, and you'll have to forgive me as I click over to the answer so I can see parts of that question as well. So part of the metadata that exists is essentially any provider, any identity provider or service provider within a federation, they've got a packet of metadata that they have to make publicly available as a provider. But that metadata is more about the provider itself. It's its public key certificate, it's any sort of attributes they would like by default perhaps. It's basically, if you wanted to talk to them, this is the bundle that you would need inside of your half of the equation. So if you're a service provider, you need the identity provider's metadata. So that by default is shared within a federation, but that is stuff relevant to the institution or organization rather than to any particular user. Now, once you get past that to the what actually gets sent when you try to log in, yes, is very highly configurable. It can be completely anonymous to the point of, yes, this user is allowed to log in to your thing, give them access to the materials we have paid for licensing for. It can be that anonymous. In fact, it can be so anonymous that every time that user shows up, it would look like a different random user. The actual identifier would be randomized every single time. And it can go all the way to the complete amount of metadata about that user that an institution knows. Everything about them could be sent. How often do they just throw up their hands in the air and give a sort of default amount of metadata? That's very hard to answer. A lot of it comes to the IT expertise, how concerned they are with privacy and what that relationship is. It's interesting because as you go through different sort of IT configurations, this falls under identity and access management. And that's something that in some institutions would fall under the information security umbrella, but in other institutions, it might fall under the Active Directory and domain administrators umbrella, which are probably, I would say, even less concerned with privacy implications and more concerned with just making sure the relationship between the two entities is functional and people are able to log in and get access to the resources they need to get access to without really scrutinizing the privacy implications of the data they're releasing, if that data is really necessary. And this speaks really to the point of the importance of a collaboration between IT and library and with privacy advocates and the vendor itself. I think one of the thoughts we talked about before was the importance of never letting the conversation become just the vendor and the IT department, because they're going to work through making it work, but the vendor is going to try to get as much information as they can, and the IT department is going to try to get it working as quickly as possible, and making sure the library stays a part of that conversation. The privacy advocates stay a part of that conversation so that the configuration can be done in such a way to preserve the privacy of the patrons. I would say, unfortunately, there's probably a bit more hand up throwing than we would want in that respect.
That's my suspicion. So in common, which is the federation we've been talking about, has the expectation, this is a question, by the way, has the expectation that personal information will be shared, but now that publishers are joining it, some publishers are getting personal data that users don't want to disclose. The justification seems to be that some readers want personalization services, but others definitely don't want that, or to have any of their personal information shared. Is there work being done on controlling attribute release so that individual users are in control of what they share with no personal sharing by default?
All right, so I've got a couple of options answers on that, and this segues well into sort of the entity category working group as well. The technical expertise of configuring these authentication systems is widely varied across institutions, and so one of the purposes of this entity category working group was to simplify the process or reduce the configurations to the point of you can say, well, this is this entity category. The relationship between the vendor and the institution justifies a use of this category. And so the categories we have are things like authentication only, which basically says, yes, this person authenticated correctly. Give them, and no information is shared about the user. And that's what one would call, completely anonymous. The vendor is basically given a yes, let them have access to it. From that level, you can then go to the next level, which is sort of authentication with a bit of information about the user. And this bit of information has to do more with trying to make sure they have access to the materials. This might be something as sending an entitlement such as this is a staff or this is a student. There's still no personally identifiable information, but there's a little bit more metadata about them. Another example would be that this person is in the law school, therefore they do have access to these legal journals that we have only licensed for law students or something like that. But who this exact law student is wouldn't be revealed. Then there's something that's, and even more, or one of the other things you can go with that also is what's called, say, a persistent ID. And this addresses the, personalization side. So I talked about how you could give an attribute which basically says every time this person logs in, they're going to get a new random identifier. So the vendor has no idea who that person is or over sessions who that person is. But then you've got what's called like a persistent identifier, which basically when that person logs into the resource, they're going to get an identifier and it's going to be pseudo random. It's not going to be matched to an email address for that person, but it is going to be the same identifier for that person every time they log into that resource. And so then you can get some certain personalization options, such as, default language that's being displayed. Unfortunately, a lot of them will retain a history of what type of articles they might have searched for. I'm not really a big fan of that one. I can understand the default language being kept, but it does give the vendor the ability to have some persistence and some personalization efforts without actually knowing who the user is. And then you can go full on, here's their first name, last name, email address, all that kind of stuff. The other side, and Shibboleth has this, a lot of the other SAML protocols can do this, which is called user consent. And it's basically when you first log into a resource, it pops up a window in front of you that says, hey, you're logging into this resource. These are the attributes they have requested us send them. Do you consent to any and all of these? And from there, the user both has knowledge of what they're sending and can consent to sending it or not. Unfortunately, that is also something that is highly configurable on the Shibboleth side or on the IDP side, which means that a fair bit of technical expertise and an understanding of the privacy implications are definitely required for the user or for the people configuring the system.
And also one of the things about, sort of privacy is sort of this notion of consent. Right now in the legal community, there's lots of sort of questions about whether, sort of an average user is really able to consent to the types of things that down the line are what are pretty negative effects of, signing away their privacy rights.
Certainly.
So, yeah.
And not only that, we don't even know the implications. A lot of this stuff, they're collecting this data and they're going to keep it indefinitely. And so the ways that it can be, say, abused today don't even compare to the ways they might be able to abuse that data in the future. So not only do they, it's easy to understand, oh, I've given them my email address. It's harder to understand what can they do with that information now and what will they be able to do with that information later.
Right. So this zooms out a little bit, or maybe we'll get to the question that I feel like you already kind of touched on it briefly, but I'll just read it aloud. One promise of SAML/Shibboleth is that by attribute an institution might be able to only allow access to specific resources to subgroups of the campus population. This might save libraries money by not licensing access for the whole campus when just a small group needs the resource. Is this something that is done elsewhere on campus regarding limiting access to specific tools, and who could help libraries think this through?
As far as elsewhere on campus, limiting access to specific tools, the things that come to mind are probably some of the more expensive pieces of software that certain programs might have, such as video editing or audio editing software, AutoCAD and drafting software. Unfortunately, or Photoshop and Adobe Suite and their licensing model as well. It'll take some real thinking actually to sort of how they do their licensing model, because with that you're talking about something that eventually has to run on your local machine. So I've seen a lot of systems out there like key servers itself, that sort of the machine itself becomes what gets to load the software. How to make that licensing model work from a library and academic journal perspective, I think might be worth looking into. I'm not coming up with a solution right off the top of my head. One of the things I was thinking about earlier when it comes to, say, SAML is you're still putting the license enforcement, you're giving that to the vendor to enforce. So for instance, you log in to say you want to see a legal journal. The vendor's system is deciding you can see that journal based off the attributes that they're receiving from the SAML packet, that yes, this is a law student or this is a law faculty, versus say the university controlling that and relationship and deciding. I think with IP based, a lot of times they handle it from an IP perspective. If they're coming from this small batch of IPs, they are in the law building or something like that to control the access. Of course, anybody walking into the building would then look like that, but they're not sending anything to the vendor other than just what the source is. However, with attributes, they're still letting the vendor become the enforcement arm by saying, okay, we're going to tell you who this person is, hopefully with the least amount of information possible that still warrants their access to the particular resource they're trying to gain access to. Not sure if that answered that question or if I got a bit off topic, but.
No, thank you. So 2 more questions. Where are best practices around single sign-on implementation decided and communicated? How could privacy-conscious librarians be heard in that discourse?
So a lot of those best practices that began are through various sort of working groups and federations. So like the In Common Federation is part of the Internet 2 effort, and so you can definitely get in contact on those avenues to try to get on those working groups when they're, say, working on the next SAML spec or the next federation manager specifications and how those are. I have, and then same with the others, like with Open Athens or Seamless Access or even Shibboleth, which is an open source program. There are avenues to get sort of on those working groups and make those privacy concerns known. I know with the entity categories working group, several librarians are on it. A lot of strong privacy advocates are on it, and there's been a lot of great conversation about the privacy concerns of various attribute release and how to minimize those while still getting the information necessary to make it pragmatic, to make it a workable solution in the first place. I mean, that's sort of the crux there is, you got to release enough info to make the relationship work, but what's the exact amount that actually needs to be released? I would like to see more security personnel on some of those things as well, just because they come at it from the angle of, how can this be enforced? How does it protect the principle of least privilege? How does it keep things confidential? But that's sort of where those opportunities are, is a lot of these things are open groups that make calls for participation.
It sounds like a good amount of the heavy lifting for privacy here is expected to come from individual libraries versus trying to influence vendors and our IT departments to value privacy. Libraries are already the loser of the power dynamic between them and vendors, and often the one between them and IT departments. How do libraries make their voices heard about their concerns? What external support from organizations, consortia, et cetera, would help them? And I think I might couple this with another question, which is, what should librarians do to advocate for our professional values with IT professionals, or to get IT professionals to share our values?
Those are some great questions. A concrete answer to them is something I certainly don't have. A lot of problems would be solved with that, I think. But there are some avenues. I think part of it will be, adding privacy and ethics. Earlier I talked about adding it to cybersecurity curriculum. A lot of IT professionals are coming from the education perspective now, instead of just learning about computers on their own. So I think there's a case to be made there that the principles that are taught in libraries about patron privacy, that kind of education needs to be brought completely into all of IT. If you're going to learn about being if we're going to go from the principle that IT principles started with library concepts and library technologies, it would make sense that the concern for privacy and the data ethics side of things needs to be brought in at an early stage of a potential IT professionals education. They should be in data privacy and ethics training courses as well, and understand sort of their responsibilities as a Active Directory or an identity and access management solution. They should recognize the implications of the responsibility of storing that. Same with email administration. They should have a definite concern for making sure that the privacy of the individual is kept not only from outside entities but from their own IT staff. I would say that's a big part of where I would like to see it get started. The other side is when we talk about, say, outside organizations. I'm a big fan of the EFF, and those are some that definitely advocate for privacy for users and individuals all over the electronic frontier. So they're definitely an organization that I think advocates privacy, but also is well established in the information technology world as a resource to look into.
All right, so we have 10 more minutes and 3 more questions, so we'll
okay.
have to rock and roll. To the best of your knowledge, to what extent are vendors using web tracking techniques, i.e. cookies, web bugs, browser, fingerprinting, etc., to re-identified, otherwise unidentified patrons sent to them through library proxy servers and or single sign-on?
So this was something I was thinking about and actually started writing down sort of maybe I need to get some other cybersecurity professionals to actually do some serious auditing of what happens when you connect to, say, a scholarly publication's website through even an anonymous proxy or through a federated sign-in. A lot of concerns were brought up from that SNSI presentation about the slide that showed all the things the library web server proxy could do and what the publisher's server would be able to see. But at the end of the day, when you're accessing that publisher's website, all the stuff that happens on the web app side of things, they can still do on their end. So there is definitely a risk of, say, re-identification of users based off of their own tracking cookies placed on a person's computer or their own browser fingerprinting. To the best of my knowledge, I have not seriously dived into that. So I don't know what level they're doing that at, but I imagine some of it is happening. It would be interesting to see how much that is. I was looking at a chart recently from the Electronic Frontier Foundation that had all the various end-to-end encrypted messaging apps like Signal, Wicker, WhatsApp, Telegram, and sort of like all these check marks about how, is their code open source? Have they survived a legal battle in which they didn't get rid of their chat logs or something like that? And I thought it'd be interesting to do the same thing to publishers from a perspective of, how much do they try to externally track a user? Possibly even outside of the confines of their contracts with the organization.
Library Freedom actually
Okay, yeah.
has a pretty cool sort of vendor report card. It's not quite
Okay.
on the same level of what you're talking about, but Library Freedom has a really cool resource like that for those of you who want to check it out.
Yeah, that might be a definite good starting place to sort of.
Next question.
From there. Yeah.
Libraries do experience cases in which there is unauthorized use or licensed resources through compromised credentials or other mechanisms. What do librarians broadly need to understand about information security so they can understand IT concerns, as we are wanting IT to understand privacy concerns?
Okay, so compromised credentials. A big part of say maintaining that confidentiality and integrity is we're saying, hey, we want people to have access only to what they're allowed to have access to, and compromised credentials immediately means somebody else is able to have access to something they're not supposed to have access to, and depending on how the security is layered will change how worrisome those compromised credentials are. Things like multi-factor authentication have been brought up. With multi-factor authentication, which is not perfect and can be bypassed, there are methods for that have come to light, but it definitely presents an additional step that can reduce the footprint of how much compromised credentials across an environment can put at risk. However, with most, say, journal access, those credentials can be used at least a little bit wider than just access to the journal. It can lead to access to other resources on campus, for sure.
So the use of shibboleth or SAML, how could it be applicable for walk-in users who are not members of the institution and do not have login? Providing this access is important for land-grant institutions.
Yes, and I come from a land-grant university, and I am definitely a fan of, the resources being available to the general public. I think that's a mission that a lot of libraries have, and I really stand behind that. And so now you're talking about a group of users who probably they're not even in the Active Directory system. They're not really an account at the university, and I'm not sure they should be. In fact, I know they shouldn't be. They should not be an account on the system. The way I see that normally solved is a certain amount of, say, generic accounts. And this problem kind of existed before needing to log in to, say, access academic resources. This already started to happen when, university libraries have an Active Directory domain, and now everybody needs to log in just to use Windows, just to even use the computer and browse the catalog locally. They already started with sort of generic accounts to do that, and this is another place where that release of information, that generic account could also give that just random. This is a random number saying it's a user from this institution, and that's all the vendor gets to know. And I think that's probably the best way to still facilitate that, at least to my current mindset, unless there's another technological way of providing that service. But the way I normally see it happen is a certain amount of just generic account and logins that are known by the library's front desk staff to help a public patron or a walk-in gain access.
Yeah, and so then the tension becomes, keeping those secure and communicating the value of access to information to the public, to people
Right.
who feel as though those are very difficult to keep secure. And so once again, a conversation about values becomes, important.
Yeah, I think in a lot of places, what you end up having is the library staff themselves are the ones that have to type in the username and type in the password, and now there's an overhead for that side of things as well. And I'm not, there's reasons to perhaps search for a more graceful method to provide for that use case, but right now it seems like it's either labor intensive or there's a high risk of the leaking of those credentials.
Right.
One
It does seem odd though, and thank you to the person who asked the question. It does seem really odd that, so many libraries, I'm at a private university and even we try to do that. So many libraries are offering this, but every library has to almost engineer it themselves because
Right.
it's not ever something that has been worked into sort of a broader understanding of what's necessary for library technology. So excellent for bringing that up. Thank you. I think we're coming to the end of our time now. So unless anybody has any last ditch questions, they're posting our information that you can reach out. One of the things that I want to make clear is that as the co-convener of the Privacy and Ethics and Technology Working Group, even non-DLF libraries, including public libraries, are welcome to participate. This is a group that was founded around these very issues, and we focus on them pretty much exclusively. So if this is your jam, please come to a PET meeting. Roy, I really want to thank you. Yeah, it's always fun to hear you talk about what you are clearly so passionate about. And I also want to thank the Office of Intellectual Freedom, Ellie, Deborah, also Aaron Berman for helping pull this together. Allison Macrina, Library Freedom, all of the people who came to our planning meeting. Thanks so much, Dorothea, and everybody who came along. So have a great day.
All right. Well, thank you for having me. This was an excellent time.
Yeah, thanks.